I'm going to be talking about building a second in command. So what I would consider, some people call it a director, some people call it a general manager. Basically somebody else other than you that runs the day-to-day operations. So you are still the owner of the company, you are still the visionary, you are still involved in marketing. We'll talk about what your role looks like later, but you are replacing your day-to-day involvement in the gym. So let's first start with why I think this is a potential path for you to consider. Really, it allows you to focus on three major buckets. So what you will shift your focus to, number one is strategy. So big picture strategy, where's the business going? You obviously are not tied today, so you have more bandwidth and time to think about where are we going to be next year. And you get to see things, I think, from a lot of times when we come to environments like this, I hear comments like, it just allows me to get away and I get to see my business from a different point of view, and hear comments that's obviously valuable from our perspective when we can see your business from a different point of view. Well, if you're not the day-to-day operator of your business, you now also have that view of your own business every single day because you're not tied to running sessions. You're not tied to answering client questions every day. So you don't need to wait 3 months, 4 months to be able to spend time looking at your business from a 30,000 foot view. You can do that every day. So I think strategy becomes a vital thing. And one quick kind of side rant on strategy, it's a bit of a mindset that some of your time is not going to be production time. You need to shift the way that you think. Part of, I think, one of the biggest growths that need to happen at this stage is, for years and for some of you decades, you've measured yourself on production, like actually doing things like coaching and admin work and doing the tasks. And in reality, not all of your time, there's still production time, of course, but a good chunk of your time is simply just visionary strategy, thinking, brainstorming. The goal is to create space to give yourself time to do that. And so sometimes that can be a little bit of a mindset shift because you feel like you're lazy or not doing enough work or not staying busy enough. But just a little side note on strategy. Of course, marketing, you would have ample time now to spend even more marketing. We'll talk about that in detail in a little while, but because this role is, fairly, I'm not going to say expensive, but this role that you hire or bring on is more expensive than a coach. So your expenses are going to go up, which means your revenue has to go up. So your marketing calendar does have to be a lot beefier than when you didn't have a general manager. So not only does it have to be beefier, but it's going to take more time to implement because it's beefier. So you're going to need more time to market, which is where you're spending kind of that second bucket of time is marketing. And then finance, of course, I don't think it's a huge part week to week, but there's definitely more money moving around. The business is bigger. And so keeping a tighter pulse on the numbers. So those, from a category perspective, I think are the reasons why, if you don't have enough time right now for marketing, strategy, and finance, I think those are the three buckets that you get to spend more time in when you do bring in that second in command. So I want to cover what I think needs to be in place before you do this, right? So we'll talk about how to do it and maybe how I've seen it done well, how I did it. But I first want to make sure that we check some boxes, that you have these things in place before you bring on a second in command. So there's 4 things. Number one is that you are at a point where you do little to no coaching and you only coach because you want to coach. If you are still tied to coaching, it is, in my opinion, not in your best interest to bring in a general manager, a day-to-day person. You want to be completely removed from day-to-day coaching because what that gives you is proof of concept that you can be the manager and not coach and the business still performs well. You want a stretch of time to prove to the business and to yourself, to your team, to your clients, that this business can operate without you coaching. And to be clear, there are some businesses that can't. There are some businesses that are so tied to the person, the owner training, that you can't get past that point and you have to be the day-to-day trainer or the day-to-day manager. So you essentially have to prove that you can play the manager before you bring on the manager. It sounds obvious, but let's make sure that we don't have a requirement. You shouldn't be on the coaching schedule if you're thinking about bringing this person on. From a revenue perspective, obviously this is largely dependent upon your profit margin and what your other expenses look like. But I think as a rough rule of thumb, you need to be doing at least $50,000 a month in monthly recurring revenue to think about bringing on a second in command. That's a rough rule of thumb. How I came up with that number is looking at, okay, how much is payroll, 40% of payroll, and then saying, okay, you're gonna have a couple coaches, you're gonna have a couple admin. We'll talk about how to pay a director, but the director is obviously gonna cost you a salary. And so while still maintaining some level of profitability for yourself, you really need to be at that revenue. So that would be number 2. The third one is a strong team with a cadence of accountability. So I wouldn't want to promote somebody or bring in somebody to be second in command when the current team does not have a strong cadence and a strong culture. So what do I mean by that? Regular team meetings, the team is on the same page. You have strong cadence of accountability with individual team members, things like the team scoreboard and 515 meetings. All of that needs to be in place because they're going to be the ones doing those. And so if you don't already have those in place, you certainly don't want to install that when somebody else is going to be the one running it. So the cadence of your weekly meetings, your 515s or versions of, and just, it's hard to quantify, but just the culture should be really strong with your team. You don't want to bring in or promote somebody that is, the team is kind of chaotic, because that is just kind of pouring it on a sloppy foundation. And then financially, in addition to gross revenue, we of course have to look at profitability. And the fourth requirement would be that you have enough profit to afford promoting somebody and backfilling that person. So we'll talk about what this person is and what they're paid and all that stuff. But the most common situation is you bring somebody from within up and you elevate their role, right? So you move them from a coach to director or general manager. Now, 9 out of 10 times their coaching load is going to decrease because they have these added responsibilities. So you need to have it in the budget to not only give them a raise for this new role, but also backfill, because let's say that their coaching load decreases by 10 hours a week, you need to go find somebody else to coach those 10 hours a week. So when you're looking at your numbers, just make sure that you not only account for their increased pay, but the backfilling of either a part-time coach or one of your other current coaches to step up and take those hours. So let's talk about what I think is the most important part in all this, which is, who is it going to be? Deciding who is going to take on this role. This is the most important part. You can have the numbers, the logistics, the everything, but this person, if you're familiar with EOS terms, we talk about like visionary and integrator. This is your integrator. They need to be able to integrate into all aspects of the business. And so I don't know if unicorn's the right word, but they're a rock star. Like, it's not just some random jabroni that happens to fill out an Indeed ad, right? It needs to be like an absolute stud rock star. And that is why the first question that I think needs to be presented, is this an internal hire, internal promotion, or an external hire, right? Is it somebody internally that I elevate up, or do I bring somebody in from the outside? Now, when you're running through that filter, there's a couple things that we can think through. Most importantly, and this is like the most important thing, tenure, length of employment does not mean that they are qualified to be your general manager. So do not think that your longest tenured employee is your best general manager. Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's not. It's more about who the person is, not how long. I think we tend to default to like, this is my longest tenured employee, and so they are naturally going to be the manager. Many of you have heard in corporate America the term of like being promoted to a level of incompetence, right? Like, you're competent at this role, and then you get promoted and you're okay. And then if you continually get promoted in corporate, and then you're in a role that you're not good at, right? The sales person versus managing a sales team, completely different skill sets. Selling the product versus managing people, completely different skill sets, right? So I think it's really important to understand that the tenure does not equal employment. As far as the whole internal versus external, I'll speak purely through case study examples. I'm fairly new in the sense of like for maybe 4 or 5 years now, coaching gym owners, but just being in the industry since 2007, I can maybe count on one hand the number of people that have brought in an external manager, and that has gone well. So I think the most common situation is to promote internally, right? And I say that not to say that an external manager, like bringing in somebody and making them the manager, can't work. I think when you see it work, in my experience, it works when it is a brand new business. Like if you look at the franchises where they bring in a director from day one and there's not cultural issues. Because even take our biggest gym here, how many trainers are on staff at Adapt? Right. So we're still talking single digits, right? So we're talking single digit team culture, which is in the grand scheme of team culture, insanely small. So I think it's a challenge and a disruptor to bring in somebody that's going to be their boss, and they've never been part of the history of the business. They've never kind of grinded. And I think in other industries, it would work fine. But in this industry, I think it would be an uphill battle. Is it still possible? I'm sure, but it's certainly a much harder hill to climb. So there are three types of people that you have on your team as far as who would be good fits for this position, who would be interested in this position. So the first one is the coach who wants to be the GM, wants to be the manager, wants growth, but is not the right fit. So as a case study, Josh became my second in command. Josh and one of my employees, Trent, they were employed at the same exact time. I hired them both at the same exact time. So they both had the same tenure. Trent was a way better coach, hands down, way better coach. Like clients loved him. Clients related to him better. He was way more social than Josh. He was an absolute rock star on the floor. The minute he stepped off the floor, he was my biggest pain in the ass. He just could not listen, didn't want to follow rules, didn't want to do anything, right? Like you all probably have an employee like that. The rock star, like the clients love them because they're energetic, they're social, they're real people connectors, but they don't like following rules. They're not detail oriented. So he would be an example of, he wanted them, like when I started getting to a point of building out a second in command, he was a coach that wanted it, but would have been terrible at it. Because I essentially would have removed him from his biggest skill set, which is connecting with people on the training floor. A lot of the second in command tasks, which we'll get to, are administrative. And that's a totally different skill set than coaching. Totally different. So the skill set that he was really excelling at would have now been removed or greatly reduced from his plate. And he would have been put in stuff like he was always the one that was never submitting his 515 on time. He was always the one that wasn't updating a spreadsheet. Like that is like the core basics of being a manager, is making sure that stuff gets done. So how can I put you in that position? So I think many of you have, maybe if you're in that period of looking at a coach, look at their off the floor skills just as much. I'm not saying being a good, like Josh is a great coach, but as far as like, if I were to rank them in favoritism, Trent won hands down. But Josh just excelled on the back end organization side of things, which I think is more important long-term for your second in command because they're coaching significantly less. So you have the coach who wants it, but they're not the right fit. Then you have the second type of person you have on your team for internal hire is the coach who doesn't want it, but you want them to want it. So you're like, wow, you would be great at this, but they don't want to be a manager. So let me give you another case study within our gym. So at that same time of hiring Josh and Trent, I also hired Chris. Many of you, I've used Chris because if I were to rank my favorite employees, he would be number one. He was amazing. He was the most loyal. Like if you know the DISC personality, he was an S. Like golden retriever, to a T, never late, never complained, rock star coach. I could have paid him $200,000 a year to be my manager, and he would have said no thanks, because he just did not want the responsibility. He just wanted to show up, coach, and go home. And he was by and large my favorite employee, lowest maintenance. Clients loved him, but he did not want any added stress. He was not motivated by money. No incentive in the world could have given him what the manager position was. So I think that's when you are kind of considering who this is going to be, just be careful not to fall into that trap of those two people, right? The person that they're the squeaky wheel, they want growth, and you're like, okay, cool, I'll kind of elevate you to director. Or you were like, wow, you would be amazing at this, and you're trying to push them into it, but they don't want it. Of course, the third is the one that is ideal, which is the person that wants it, and you deem that they have the traits that is the right fit for that job. And that's obviously the marriage that you want for that person. Now, as far as skills that you're looking for, I think there's skills that can't be taught, or maybe traits is a better term, because maybe if you can make an argument that a skill can be taught. Traits that can't be taught. You want to focus on the things that cannot be taught. So things that cannot be taught: high attention to detail. High attention to detail. 90% of a manager's job is just making sure stuff gets done. And so if they don't have a high attention to detail, there's no way they're going to track if stuff is getting done. And so they need to have a high attention to detail, and you cannot teach that. You can't. You just have it or you don't. And you can be a great coach, but if you don't have a high attention to detail, you're not going to be a good manager. Strong leader. That person that commands the room. And this was a growth for me, I think, and I see it in other managers. That does not need to be the loudest person. Using Josh as an example, I think he was, and clearly is now as the owner, a great second in command and was the right choice, but he led completely different than I did. Completely different, right? So you can be a good leader, it just doesn't have to be the same. Like, leaderships have styles. For those of you that follow sports, like, the coaches can be good leaders, and one's more of a head down, quiet, still respectable versus loud, boisterous. There's all different kind of styles of leadership. I don't think that was a period of growth for me when I was building out second in command. They don't have to lead the same way that I do. They can still be perceived as a leader. And some of that is intangible. How do you measure it? I don't know. What I did a lot of is going around to other team members, going around to clients and asking them, do you look at so-and-so as a leader? Do you feel that they're a leader? Do you look up to that team member? And you got to have some pretty frank conversations, and you have to have a culture of transparency where they're actually willing to share that. But oftentimes that's a gut feeling. And then certainly they have to be good at being a connector with the clients and the team, and being able to, they don't have to be the most extroverted person, but they have to be able to kind of keep the connection tight between client and team members, right? Because they're essentially managing both. They're managing the client expectation, and they're managing team expectation, and working together in tandem. So, great framework for those that aren't familiar with it. I love the GWC framework. It's very basic. It's from EOS. It's one of those tools that we talk about, things that apply to our business. I think this is a framework that applies to any business. And so GWC, if you're not familiar with it, is get it, want it, capacity to do it. It's a very easy filter when you're deciding if somebody's going to be a good fit. So do they get it? Do they understand what the position entails? Do they want it? Do they have the desire? So for example, Chris, that employee I mentioned, he might get it, but he doesn't want it. Right? There's no desire or want. And then capacity. So capacity, make sure you look at capacity both personally and professionally. So the professional capacity may be logistics, like, do you have enough? Can we create a schedule where you have some bandwidth to work on some of this other stuff? Personal capacity, I think, is even more important. So what do I mean by personal capacity? When I was growing my gym in what I would consider to be the growth years. So from 2014 to 2017, those were our three biggest growth years. That's where we went from 500 to 900 in those 3 years. I didn't have kids. I was newly married. I could grind all day long. So I had a high personal capacity, right? For me to then compare that to 2023, It's a totally different personal capacity. And so some of this, if the reality of our industry is, I do feel that, obviously you got to legally be careful but internally as you're thinking about this, like this person needs to have high work capacity. So it doesn't mean, like, I'm not saying kids versus no kids, age versus not age. That's not what I'm saying. There's, like, for example, we had a neighbor at our old house that the wife was just a straight hustler. Like, kids were old enough where she didn't have to be home, and she was on the road from Monday morning. She would fly out and she would fly back home Friday. Just sales, hustling, going and visit different locations, just complete hustle mode. And so I do think you need to have somebody that's in that phase of life. And I do think it's a phase of life where they can be have that capacity where they don't care about if it's a 10-hour day. They don't care about if it's a 12-hour day. They don't care if they have to work from home a little bit. And that takes a certain, I think, lifestyle to be able to support that. So I would look at capacity. So let's look at how you potentially structure this person's role. So numbers-wise, this position definitely has to be salaried. It would be really hard not to have it salaried because it's really hard to make this an hourly job. And frankly, if you look at the difference between hourly and salary, salary should be based upon the result they produce, not the hours they work. Hourly is based on the hours you work, and it is my job to make sure you produce a result. That's how I've always thought about the difference in our industry between hourly and salary. If you are hourly, you get paid for the hours you work, and it is up to me to make sure that those produce a result. If you are salary, it is up to you to produce the result, and I don't care how many hours it takes. So salary is definitely a phenomenal structure for this. And the most common thing that we see is salary with some type of incentive on the back end. So the incentive can be, frankly, anything. The most common one we see is either net client growth or top line revenue growth. Just make sure that you incentivize something that they can control. So if they don't control it, then they should not be incentivized on it. For example, you should not incentivize net profit because they do not have a choice for, most likely, control over expenses. So don't incentivize bottom line. If they're doing sales and marketing, then they have control over top line, so they can be incentivized on top line. If they're looking at client experience and all that, they can be incentivized on net new clients. And we can, again, I hope to have some time in a few minutes to go over, those of you that have directors in place, maybe how you incentivize and certainly brainstorm around this position, because there's no one way of structuring their pay. Typically, I see their base is about 20% higher than a coach. So whatever your let's say that your coach makes 40, this manager is probably making 50 as a base, plus their bonus. Now, that's very market dependent. I'm not talking those specific numbers, but if you're paying your coach 40, this person's going to have 50 as a base, plus, depending upon how the business performs, 70, 80, 90 potentially with commissions or bonuses. You can also commission off of sales as well, if they're doing the sales, which we'll talk about their day-to-day role. And then just make sure, as a reminder, you factor in hiring a part-time coach, because they are going to be coaching less. So you do have to factor in when you run your numbers, to make sure you factor in at least a part-time coach. So what does their role look like on any given week? So on any given week, I think there's five buckets of things that they do, right? Any given week they have 5 things that they do. Number 1 is coach. This industry does not, and I tried it, and I failed miserably, if you were not aware. I had a stretch of time where I did not coach, and I had Mel and Josh, many of you remember, and Josh coached very little. Mel was purely client experience, didn't coach, no coaching ever. And business was good, it was productive, but we were not nearly as profitable. So I think it's a reminder that this business is still very small, still very lean. So they still need to have a coaching role. I don't think we have enough margin to have multiple people on the team that are not coaching. It's just the margins don't exist, right? And when I say multiple, I mean the owner. Then you probably have an admin that doesn't coach. Then you have this general manager. If they're not coaching, that's another part-time, potentially full-time role that you have to hire. The margins just aren't there. So as far as how much coaching they do, everybody has different schools of thought on this. Mine has always been a full-time coach is probably about 30 hours a week of coaching, right? 30 hours a week of coaching. So if they're full-time, they're closer to 40. They probably have 6 to 10 hours of kind of back-end client support and then 30 hours of coaching. The director or the GM is closer to that 15 to 20 mark, right? 15 to 20 hours a week on a normal week. That gives them enough repetition where they're still attached to the product. They're still filling a decent load, but they have, and this is a reminder, this person, because you will hear it, and those of you that have one, hear it now, I don't have enough time to get all this stuff done. Well, listen, if you're coaching 15 hours a week, you have 25 hours a week to get this stuff done. And frankly, this business is not that complicated. You can manage it in 25 hours a week. No problem. So the other reason why I like 15 to 20 is during what I would call vacancy weeks, where there's somebody out sick, there's somebody on vacation. This is where, if you remember my levels, I talked about not being the first phone call. This person is that phone call of, hey, I'm out sick. Obviously, vacations you should have advance notice on. But they are also, and this is the whole like, get it, do they get it that this is part of the role? And by the way, going back to Chris' example, this was the part that he didn't want anything to do with, right? That was his whole thing. Like, sure, could he be a great day-to-day manager? Yeah, but like, I don't want to be called in on a Friday night to go coach the afternoon session. Well, then this is not the position for you. You have to be okay. If you want the higher pay, if you want the bonus and the commission, you have to be okay that when a coach is on vacation. So how I see it most times is when a coach is on vacation, this person basically flexes to just be a coach that week, because they're essentially going to coach probably 30-ish hours a week because they're going to absorb that session load, right? Maybe even more, 35 hours a week. So don't expect them to be doing a full great manager job that week. But the reality of, I mean, if you got 52 weeks in a year and you got 5 team members, I mean, we're talking probably 10 weeks a year that there's some type of disruption. So it's not like it's happening every single week. So on a normal week, you're fully staffed. They're basically, think of it as 50-50, coaching half, managerial half. And then they're the first phone call when somebody's out sick, and they're the ones, we'll talk about the rest of their role, doing scheduling and things like that for when there's vacations. So coaching is bucket number 1. They flex up when a coach is out, and they have their steady sessions that they're responsible for. Then you have about 5 hours a week, typically is what I find it to be, of training, staff development. And that's typically broken into your team meeting, your individual 5-15 meetings, and then any miscellaneous onboarding. If there's a new hire, training a team member one-on-one that's got a weak point, whatever it may be. It's typically about an hour a day is the way to think about it. 1 hour of their day should be devoted to developing their team. So it's probably not that clean and organized. Like, you can't block. This is where I mean it has to be about results, not about time. You can't like block off like from 1 to 2 is going to be staff development. If you have to do that, they're not the right person. What you more so need to find is the person that every day they know, hey, if I'm not coaching and my admin stuff, which we'll get to, is done, I need to be making sure my team is good. 5-15s are obviously scheduled. Team meetings are scheduled. But even that, if you got 5 team members, I mean, that's not 5 hours, right? It's maybe 3 hours. So there's that miscellaneous, maybe they observe a session. Maybe they know this coach is struggling with cueing this exercise, so they work with them for 10 or 15 minutes on that. There's definitely that kind of what I would call spot training that happens throughout the week. But if you're like budgeting hours, it's about 5 hours a week is what I budgeted. And then you have another 5. So at this point, we're at bucket number 3. And this is what I lump together as scheduling, programming, and client admin. Scheduling, programming, and client admin. So scheduling is both client-facing schedule and team schedule. So they do the client scheduling, obviously not scheduling for them, but producing, like Josh would be pulling the monthly report to look at session attendance and deeming if any sessions need changed. And if he had any, we'll talk about cadence with you as the owner, but he would bring those to Monday meetings. Hey, I think next month when we do our schedule, we should cut this session, or hey, we need to add a time here. So you can still be involved in the decision-making, but they should be the one looking at the schedule. So they're doing both the client schedule and they're doing the team schedule. So they're the ones putting the team schedule together, whether you do that monthly or quarterly, some rhythm there. They're also the ones overseeing programming. And I say client admin because they inevitably are going to be the point person for what I might call like level 2 questions. So questions from a client or issues with a client that the kind of frontline employee, the coach, or if you do have an admin, can't answer, client wants to cancel, things like that, go to them. So everybody had to sit and meet with Josh if they wanted to cancel membership, or at least do a phone call with him, right? Not anybody can process cancellation. So you do want to have kind of that small chain of command for client admin related stuff. So that's why I lumped that into that bucket. Then you have, and this is where everybody, I think, misses the boat, is the 5 hours. I believe there's a massive benefit to having this person be the person that does internal marketing, not external, but internal. Because they have, the challenge is you'll still be able to do, we'll talk about what your role looks like in a minute, kind of day to day, but you're still doing the marketing calendar, right? They're not marketing strategy. Don't make that mistake. I also made that mistake, thinking that my 12, 13 years of learning marketing was going to be replaced by somebody that's never marketed before, even though they've been in our gym for 10 years. They don't know marketing, but they can execute the plan. And they are now the face of the day-to-day. So when it comes time to like reactivation reach outs, they can do those all day long, right? Because they know the clients, you can give them the script of what to say, and they can work through the list of reactivations. If you're running things like referrals for clients and you want coaches handing out gift cards and VIP passes to clients, they can do that because they're the ones communicating with the coaches. They're the ones that at pre-shift, they're stuffing the coaches' pockets with 5 gift cards to hand out. They can be the ones on a Friday afternoon when it's a little slow and all their work's done. They can go visit the business and drop off the gift basket. By the way, none of you are doing that because I asked for a picture and you didn't post it. Do it. It works. So the internal marketing, I think, one, it certainly helps because they are, like, you are now removed day to day. And so it helps them become the face of it. But also, I think it's a little humbling for them as well. Like, they realize and kind of start to learn at a low risk way what's involved in needing to acquire clients. So it's both effective because it's internal and people already know you and they can kind of build their face, but it's also humbling so they can see what's involved in growing this thing. So that's another 5 hours. And then your final 5, so we're at about 40, right? Every week is a little different, but we're at 40 now, is sales. They are the one typically doing new client sales. I'm assuming that at this level, you probably have about a sale a day. And so they are the one doing the strategy session, the game planning session, the what have yous. So notice, how does your role change? And this is where I'll end with, and then I want to brainstorm those of you that have directors, anything I didn't cover, share best practices. Some of you, like this area here, that wants to potentially add one, we can flush out what that might look like. What does your role look like? So I talked about big buckets, right? Marketing, strategy, finance. But week to week, there are really 3 things that you need to do, and you cannot not do these things. You cannot take your finger off the pulse on these things because the business will quickly slip away from you if not. Number 1 is you need a weekly cadence with this person. This person, one-on-one, is really your only meeting. You can still go to the team meeting, but your director, your GM should be running the meeting. That helps position them as the leader. That is one growing pain. There's many growing pains with this transition. One growing pain will be the internal culture shift that happens when you now have to make them the leader internally, and for years your team has gone to you for everything. One of the easiest ways to make that happen is to have them run the team meetings and have them do the 515s. But you need to have a leadership meeting with them. I call it leadership meeting, call it management meeting, call it whatever you want, director's meeting. It was every Monday morning. I like Monday mornings because it kicks off the week. And so I made sure, like, for example, Josh coached Monday morning during peak time. And then at 10:30, we would get together and make sure the week's all mapped out. So we go through KPIs, we go through, I can share the agenda if you want it. I didn't have it on this doc, but I'm happy to share it. We would go through scoreboard, like high-level scoreboard numbers that are off track. We would go through each individual team member and any issues or training opportunities that they have. And we would go through current internal marketing. And it was all relevant to that week, right? It was all relevant to that week because we're having this meeting every week. So I don't need to be talking about things that are happening next month in that meeting. I want to talk to him and get him or her set for the week. If you can get your second in command set for the week, that is your goal. Your goal is not to be completely removed, but your goal, like, it should get to, assuming this is, I know for a lot of you, this is your goal, to be removed from the business. It should be to the point where there's the Monday meeting and then they ride until next Monday. And then you circle back with them on the following Monday. So it shouldn't, from a time ROI standpoint, everything should really be isolated for your time with them, with frontline employees, to that Monday. And I say Mondays, it can be a different day, but Mondays, frankly, just works really well. So you have that, and then you do need to have a tighter, much tighter, for most of you, handle of your numbers, because that is how you are now measuring, because you will lose the ability to measure your business based on feel. You will lose the ability, because you're not there as much, you will lose the ability, or you will give yourself what's happening over here at this table, name names, but what's happening over here is you think the business is much worse than it really is, because you feel, because you're not there or because you're not producing, that the business, when in fact, if you look at the scoreboard, the business is just fine. So it can go both ways. It can go I'm not watching the scoreboard and all of a sudden these numbers are way off track and I have to step in and rebound. Or you can start to tell yourself stories because you're not there. You think the business is falling apart, when in reality, if you look at the numbers, it's just fine. So I hate to say it because you can certainly take it too far and be like corporate and only be about the numbers, but you very much, other than your leadership meeting with your second in command, are running your business truly off of how the numbers are doing. So like I did on Fridays, I had a 1 hour reoccurring meeting with myself every Friday to review the scoreboard. And every number went one by one, and I would bring anything. That's why I did Friday. And then for Monday, I would bring anything to Josh on Monday of like action items, right? So they're more like implement the plan, you create the plan is maybe a better way to think about it. And then the third area is your marketing calendar. You still do all of the external marketing. So you're still creating the marketing calendar. You're still making sure the marketing gets done. You still have to have a tight, and that's where the scoreboard comes in. You still have to have a tight pulse on, is the marketing working? Again, the marketing calendar, once you have this position, is going to need to be bigger because you have more expenses, which means you're going to need more clients, which means you're going to need more leads. So the marketing calendar needs to be bigger. Granted, you're not the one implementing a lot of it because at this point you probably have somebody running your ads for you. You probably have the second in command doing the internal marketing, but you definitely have, like, every week pulling up the plan, going one by one. Is it on track? So you all plan your own weeks however you want. I'll just share how I did it. It worked well. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Monday was with Josh. Let's set the week with him straight. Week's good. Operationally, he's good to go. Wednesdays was marketing. Every Wednesday, I pull up the marketing plan. By that point, I have a couple days into the week. I can see how leads are tracking. I can see how everything's going marketing-wise. So Wednesday, I had an hour or two on marketing, and then Friday was scoreboard. So that was a nice rhythm. you can clearly see there's also plenty of autonomy to do tons of other stuff, should that be in the gym or not the gym, on the other hours and days of the week. But that's how I broke it up. So from a 30,000 foot view, that's how you install second in command into your gym. What I would like to get to next is more of a brainstorming session for starting with those of you that have this position in place. Maybe any takeaways, lessons learned of things that you can share. For context, I believe it was Melanie and Jason and Luke are wanting to potentially put one in place. Shelby has a new one in place. And Graham and Jeff have had them in place for a long time, just to kind of give you some context to what we're facing as far as in the room when we share best practices.